young people have always led the way in social advancement, whether in protests against the US war in Vietnam, the 1968 movement in France, the anti-apartheid campus divestment campaigns, or more recently, the student-led opposition to Western support for the genocide in Gaza. The same is true when it comes to queer and trans rights, but they have not always gotten the credit. We're fixing that today. It's Pride Month. I'm your host, Ramsey Nasser, and this is Sustainability Matters by Gruyter, Brill. So if young people have been at the forefront of movements for universal suffrage, civil rights, labor rights, and peace movements, then it should be no surprise that queer and trans youth have also been leading the way in the queer and trans rights movement and beyond. But how exactly have they organized? What obstacles have they faced? How has their activism evolved over time? And why have their contributions so often been erased? Well, to help us answer all of those questions and so much more, we are joined by none other than Dr. Julia Sinclair-Palm. Dr. Sinclair-Palm is author of Queer and Trans Youth Political Activism, which is Chapter 17 in the De Gruyter Handbook of Youth Activism, published this year by De Gruyter Brill. Dr. Julia Sinclair-Palm, welcome to the program.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. I'll start by saying that I work at UBC in the Faculty of Education, the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy, and that I'm an associate professor of teaching there, and that I'm also the director of a new center in the Faculty of Education called the Robert Quartermain Center for SOGI Inclusive Excellence in Education.
It's great to have you with us. To kick us off, let's talk about your chapter. You talk about how histories of LGBT activism often exclude youth, despite significant levels of activity and contributions. And I have to say, when I read that, I hadn't thought of it before, but after reading it, I couldn't unsee it. You chart a history of queer and trans youth activism in the United States and Canada over the past 80 or so years, and describe it as evolving from a deficit model where LGBT youth needed adult intervention and protection to them becoming agents of their own subjectivities. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a loss that we haven't kind of incorporated our understanding of youth activism within, larger LGBT activism. I think we really need to kind of take a look at that. I think there's interesting and really smart strategies that LGBTQ youth are doing in their activism. But as you mentioned, right, a lot of this work around LGBTQ activism kind of starts from this deficit model. And what I mean by that is there's been this hyper focus on risk, that we can kind of only understand LGBTQ youth through this lens of risk. And what that allows adults to do is then step in and need to protect youth, right? That's kind of how the equation goes in some ways. And so I recently wrote a piece with my colleague, LJ Slovin, called The Risk of Risk, and it's in the Journal of Queer and Trans Studies in Education. And I kind of go with Dr. Slovin into more of this discussion about how risk has become this narrative strategy to compel safety interventions in schools. And that's was in some sense part of that start of GSAs, but is different than a lot of the kind of earlier work of LGBT organizations like Vanguard that were more street-based organizations, less school. And so this shift into the school, I think, led to more adult intervention, more of kind of structure where the adult does the protecting of the young person. And so then, positioning young people as gout risk, like I mentioned, kind of leads adults into that role of protection. And this trickles down on so many levels, right? You can look at school reports that George Bush put forward and other people. Over the years, there's been these strategies to address the harassment and bullying that LGBTQ youth face in schools. And it all then gets implemented through an adult lens, through an adult strategy, and youth are left out of these conversations.
That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned GSAs there in that answer, which I know from reading your article. stands for Gay Straight Alliances. And you spend a considerable portion of your chapter talking about them and their history. And I thought it was, I mean, I didn't know anything about it. It was really fascinating for me. Could you share a little bit of that with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting to think about how, lesbian and gay adults were trying to figure out how to gain respect or maybe rights or legitimacy within the 1960s. And so these adult, what were called homophile organizations, were using tactics of deciding to try to assimilate with society. So kind of not trying to stand out. And so I think that kind of shifted then in the mid 1970s to leaders in the gay community being really interested in protecting kids, right? They were like interested in developing school-based programs for queer youth. And you're also getting more cisgender and heterosexual adults kind of stepping into those roles in school. So it's not just, there's like very few gay men that are teachers because of the way homophobia functions in schools. A lot of like male teachers get cast as pedophiles. And so it really limits the number of gay and lesbian teachers there are in schools. Anyways, so the like number of, queer youth programs increased as policy noticed there was a need for addressing this harassment and discrimination. And so, we kind of got GSAs in some sense out of that, out of students seeking a need for these groups and a few adults stepping in to kind of provide leadership there. So researchers say that, right, GSAs began as adult-initiated school clubs, and now they're youth-led organizations. And I think there's some complexity there, right? I think it really depends on the school, really depends on the city and the context and all of those things. And of course, the interesting part about schools is that there's always new students. Teachers often remain in the same school for years, but there's always new students. And that means there's always new forms of leadership, new students that want to take on different projects, that want to have this amount of, this kind of role or that kind of role. And so I think there is some consistency that's offered by adults staying in those roles for long periods of time. And I think adults offer also kind of, a different lens, some like helpful strategies, and then hopefully resources around how to navigate schools and things like that. So I think there has been an acknowledgement that youth have agency, that youth have rights, that young people have voices that should be heard. And I think that's been part of that shift over the last couple decades or 2 decades maybe in how GSAs are run. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, now comes the hard part. Trans people go to the bathroom. Trans people play sports. Yes, shocking.
Brutal.
And trans youth want sexual education appropriate for their sexualities. Cue the ominous music and the shrieking. Listeners to the Sustainability Matters podcast, regular listeners will know that we love going to first principles and defining terms here. And you used a term I was unfamiliar with throughout your chapter, and that term is gender panic. It sounds a lot like moral panic to me, but I didn't know if those two terms are related, what the differences between them might be. What is a gender panic and how does it function?
Yeah. So I think of moral panic as kind of like an umbrella for a whole bunch of different panics. Gender panic being one of them, sex panic being another. And someone named Kristen Schultz describes gender panic as, quote, a deep cultural fear set off, in this case, when the naturalness of a male-female gender binary is challenged. So gender panic arises when kind of this idea of gender essentialism is challenged. And gender essentialism, right, is about this idea that our sex and our gender align and that we have like certain scripts and narratives about what it means that aligns. And so gender panic is when that gets disrupted. In many ways, trans and queer people disrupt our kind of normative conceptualizations about gender in such lovely ways. And, gender essentialism, right, kind of denies the existence of trans people because it says always our sex needs to align with our gender. There's also someone named Nanny who writes about this concept of gender panic in the Sage Encyclopedia of Trans Studies and really looks at kind of these biology-based ideologies and then the struggle to understand the relationship between kind of like sex and gender. And those are complicated relationships. I'm not going to say they're easy to narrate or describe. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Yeah. But these have been happening for years, right? There's like so many different panics we've had over the decades. Yeah.
Understood. Okay. And these panics are something which I personally must confess I find off-putting. As a class warrior, not a culture warrior, I'm a little bit allergic to all of the polemic madness around these issues. And, I think when I think about it, it just seems very unfair because queer and trans people never asked for their existence to be used as the central pillar of the culture wars. I mean, we all know the proportion of the population which is actually even trans is rather insignificant compared to the hysteria around them. I don't know if you know any statistics or stats on that, but yet here we are. And I wonder, do you as an expert in this field, do you share this concern that, to put this into a question, how does one advance one's rights without falling into the trap of the spectacle and performance of it all? How can trans and queer youth or trans and queer people more generally avoid making themselves into punching bags for others with different agendas? Specifically, I'm thinking here about the elites, the wealthy elites, who are always concerned about the potential for mass insurgency and are always looking for ways to redirect energies of the population to punch down or out against marginalized communities and therefore avoid the risk of a mass insurgency punching up against them. So that's their agenda. And so obviously it's in the interests of those elites to foment this cultural war and this cultural discord. And none of that means that trans people should not be able to fight for themselves or defend their rights. So how does one find that right balance? Do you understand that issue?
Yeah, I think you're like raising really interesting questions here. The like question I'm thinking about from kind of what you've said is this idea of like, how do we fight for rights? How does a marginalized community get access to more rights within a society that wants to deny their existence, erase them, take away resources, take away all these things, right? And I think the trans rights movement has tried the strategy of a little bit of like, we're just like you, we're human too. And I think it's worth questioning if that's working, right? There's someone named Jules Gold-Peterson, who's a fantastic trans scholar and writes about this and has this piece called Reject Transgender Liberalism. And Gil Peterson is writing about kind of this thing you're raising exactly of like, okay, so we've been battling for this kind of within this like realm of culture war for a long time. But what if the fight that trans people should be exploring is more around class? And that actually a lot of kind of this like distinction between kind of class war versus cultural war in some ways kind of erupted in the 1990s within trans communities, and that there were some trans folks who, really wanted rights in a particular kind of way, rights to do their gender how they wanted to, et cetera. And another group of trans folks, and particularly transsexual women, who wanted access to gender affirming care. That was what was important to them. That was what was going to get them, jobs and access to wealth. That, like so many trans folks face poverty. And that part of not being able to have a successful job is tied to how society reads you. Anyway, so Gil Peterson is writing about like a quote from this article that I really like is the real antagonism concealed within the movement for transgender rights since the 1990s is class-based. The material struggle to transition has given way to the concerns of a small transgender professional class who have popularized their own interests and values as if they were universally emancipatory. And so this like cost of medical care, keeping a job in the way our like cisgendered labor market functions really limits the ability for transsexual women to succeed. And so, like, I think you're raising interesting questions around like what's the strategy that trans folks should be using, and who gets prioritized within those fights for rights or fights for access to gender affirming care or whatever. And that maybe we're actually, of course, we are leaving out the most marginalized voices and experiences within the trans community when we take up that idea of ignoring the way that access to gender affirming care is actually really essential and is a class-based fight, right? I think this other piece that plays a role here is that a lot of what conservatives are doing within this dynamic and within this fight for rights is that conservatives are suggesting that trans children are new. And you're giving me a curious, questioning face.
Well, what do you mean? What do they mean? Trans children are new?
That there haven't been children who identify as transgender before or trans before.
Okay.
That there's a new thing where kids are identifying as trans, and that's just not true. That's a lie. And again, Gil Peterson writes about this too, right? She's a historian, and so she's gone through so many medical records to look at how, of course, trans children have always existed, and a lot of those transsexual women in the archives are asking for gender affirming care. And the kind of lie about trans children's newness perpetuates this idea again that we kind of started with of a need to protect children, and in particular trans children, because maybe they're transitioning too soon, maybe they don't know, right? It just denies all of these pieces around young trans people knowing what's best for them, and perpetuates again that idea that children need adults to make decisions. Yeah. So I think you're onto something, and I'm curious to see how the trans community and all, the multiplicity of pockets within the trans community kind of thinks about this stuff moving forward.
I have so many questions about that in-depth answer, but I suppose the most important one, I think, for our listeners might be that they share my ignorance. Forgive me for asking a basic question. I don't know. And I can only assume that our audience members might not also know. What is gender affirming care?
Great. So gender affirming care is care that allows someone to access resources to have their gender present the way they identify their gender. So like it could be having access to clothing even, right? It could be access to a haircut, but more often gender affirming care is tied to things like hormones. It could be hormone blockers. So often, right, in order to support someone having the body they want and not having a whole bunch of like gender dysphoria because their body is going through puberty, pausing or blocking them from going into puberty is one of the kind of ways that gender affirming care functions for the lives of like young trans people. So I think there's this idea perpetuated by the right that we're like going in and doing like surgeries, and that's just not happening. And so it's more about, young people getting access to like things like hormone blockers, things like hormones, and getting support, right? There's a lot to know, a lot to learn. And so feeling supported in your gender.
Okay, we could take that in so many different directions. I have so many more questions to ask, but I do want to move on to make sure that we do spend some time talking about bathrooms, because they seem to be incredibly important. You mentioned in your article some research that shows how bathrooms designate who does and who does not belong. And I read that and I thought, but how? I mean, what is the mechanism that a bathroom decides who does and does not belong? Once again, I apologize for asking what may on the face of it seem like a stupid question. I just honestly, genuinely do not understand. I mean, as my own personal bias, I don't even understand why bathrooms are segregated in the first place. I've gone to restaurants all the time where there's unisex bathroom, Sometimes bathrooms are segregated, sometimes they're not. I've not thought too much about it. I presume perhaps you have. Do you know why bathrooms are segregated in the first place? And whatever function that is meant to serve, is it still necessary in a modern society? Am I missing something? Can you help me fill in the pieces here on bathrooms?
So there's debates about the emergence of sex segregated toilets in the US and Europe. And I have an idea that it comes down to this like public private sphere of women and men. And that, right, there's this idea that women stay in the private sphere and men go out into the public and do work. And so I think in a lot of factories, you had mostly men working in factories for so long that they didn't have, why would they have sex segregated toilets in factories until women, of course, entered the workforce. And then it became seen as not respectable to have women using what was then understood as like the men's toilet or using the same toilet as men.
Why? I'm sorry to tease it out. Do we know why?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I learned about was this idea of this separate spheres movement. So I think there's probably like a lot of ideologies and beliefs around kind of what our sexes should do or should not do together. And I definitely don't know a lot about that, but I do know that I have an idea that kind of like the workplace is maybe one of those things that kind of started this, because of course we all use a gender neutral washroom at home, right? Like every one of us knows what that's like. We're all very familiar with it. So it's so strange that when you go out into the public, especially public institutions that we're funding, have these segregated washrooms. And so I think it's important that I think the like real thing to take home here is that trans people should be able to use whatever the bathroom aligns with their gender, and they should be able to have access to it. And this like pushback that funding is the reason they aren't able to accommodate trans people is ridiculous. It's about what you prioritize. And I think we need to prioritize trans people. And so I think schools especially are one of those sites where we really need to make sure there's gender neutral washrooms.
I have so much more I could say on bathrooms. But let's move on. Perhaps we'll return to bathrooms later. I did want to make sure that we had time to ask you about this case that you brought up in your chapter. And it's the case of a student named Gavin Grimm. And this young person argued that he should be allowed to use the gender-appropriate bathroom for him because, just like somebody with cancer, he did not choose to be trans. And his case became emblematic, I think, in the United States, and therefore you referred to his case in your article. And I have to tell you, when I read that analogy in his core argumentation, in his self-defense, it stopped me dead in my tracks because, I live in Madrid, and, I've seen a number of gay men here with this Lady Gaga, I think, inspired Born This Way, tattoos somewhere on their body, for example. And every time I see these arguments, these slogans, I really wonder if this is the right approach to be taking. Do we want to be comparing trans identity to having cancer? Is that really the right analogy? I mean, to say I was born this way is to say, I agree with you. There is something disgusting, abhorrent, sinful, terrible about me, but it isn't my fault. It was something, these are circumstances beyond my control. I was born with this disease, and therefore you should have pity on my diseased, abject self. I mean, that implicit argument in saying, this is out of my control, it's not my fault, I'm this awful thing, it doesn't sound particularly liberatory to me. It's kind of an apology for being trans, as opposed to reinforcing the argument that there's nothing wrong with being trans or gay or whatnot. Am I missing something? I mean, because I read that in your chapter, and you wrote it without comment, and it set me back. Am I missing something?
I think it's these like the struggle to the struggle to advocate for trans rights. What is it that's going to make Gavin be able to use the bathroom he wants to use? And I think in a sense, he's forced into playing that like what's seen often as like a victim card, right? Like, will you care about me if I have no control over what's happening to me? Because maybe you'll care more about me and give me more rights if I advocate within that frame rather than I deserve these things. I'm a human. And so, I think what's important here is the way that rights for young people in schools are being advocated for. Who's doing that advocating? What's the kind of angle they're taking? When do they get to be taken seriously? And Gavin was in that case for so many years. It dominated his life. And, he's just an individual, right? It's like Gavin's individual liberatory situation. And so I think one of the tricky pieces is we forget about the kind of the fullness of the trans community, right? Gavin's white. And I think these things matter to like who gets to have rights and how they advocate for those rights. But, I would say, right, like this Born This Way is also a response to conversion therapy, which has been around for years. And conversion therapy is, it's horrific. It's had a huge impact on the trans community and the gay community. And I think in a way, this Born This Way narrative kind of pushes back against this conversion therapy piece of, this is who I am. You can't change me. I was born this way.
Yeah. When you say conversion therapy, I assume you referred to psychological treatment, which is intended to convince a gay person that they're straight or a trans person that they're not. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And what did you mean when I didn't catch the implication when you said it's important to highlight that Gavin Grimm is a white trans man? What did I miss there? What did you mean by that?
I think a lot of the fight for trans rights has, I think, left out the marginalized folks within the trans community and the needs for those folks. I think too often when we think about trans folks and rights, we think about white trans people. We think about, in particular, white trans people that pass as men or women, that are read as cisgender. That this idea of visibility and who gets to be seen as like a good trans person, I'm putting that in quotes, or a bad trans person is really impacted by colonization, is really impacted by racism. All these things get layered onto our understanding of which trans people get rights and what rights they get.
I think I caught it. You're saying that Gavin Grimm likening his trans identity to cancer is part of a trans liberalism argument.
Yes.
That you were referring to earlier, which is more likely to be propagated by a white or otherwise non-marginal trans person.
Yeah. And this isn't to say that necessarily Gavin chose that argument, right? Gavin's lawyers chose that argument. So I'm not here to blame Gavin necessarily. I'm here to identify the kind of structures and systems and discourses at work within these cases.
Okay. I don't want to go on too long about that. Let's talk about the right wing in North America, who were until 2 minutes ago against gay pride, gay marriage, gay rights in general, and have over the past decade really embraced homo-nationalist arguments. We all know these arguments. These are the kinds of streams of thinking that suggest that Muslim-majority countries abroad have homophobic cultures where women cover their hair, and therefore we should bomb girls' schools over there, as we saw at the beginning of the U.S. war on Iran, or blockade and starve men, women, and children over there, as we continue to see in the ongoing Gaza genocide, etc. These same political formations, right-wing conservative North American political formations, that continue to espouse this thinking are also the same political formations that are pushing anti-trans laws in U.S. state legislatures. How can we explain this cognitive dissonance and incoherence?
So I guess the thing I would push back against this idea that we are all for gay marriage and gay rights in general now. I don't think the right is. So I guess I disagree with that premise. And I would say that I think the right, like, isn't that interested in having a coherent argument. There's like so many inconsistencies to confine in there, the kind of things they take up or put aside. And I think part of that is like a distraction, right? It's to keep us not focusing on all the atrocities they're committing. So I think there's a way that like the right is constantly trying to distract us from the real issues. And I think part of what we need to do instead, right, is like stay focused on ensuring that trans youth have access to gender affirming care, that queer and trans youth feel safe in schools, they feel welcomed, and that trans youth can play sports if they want to. They have a bathroom. When we get caught up in what the right is saying, we kind of lose attention on what really matters.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that the right is for gay pride. I meant to say the opposite, that they're against gay rights at home, but then all of a sudden, in order to justify military intervention abroad, suddenly they purport to care about gay and LGBT populations and women more broadly in Black and brown countries.
Right. We're not homophobic here. They're homophobic over there.
Right, exactly. Right. Another bad faith line of argumentation that the anti-trans movement likes to employ is to ask people what a woman is. And, you know, I don't know if you've seen this. The algorithm has sent this to me numerous times over the past number of years. These sort of street interviews where this question is employed as a kind of a gotcha, usually against very young teenage first-year undergraduates who really are unable to succinctly articulate the difference between sex and gender. And this generalized inarticulateness among teenage American first-year university students is taken as proof that the people promoting trans rights do not know what a woman is. So I don't want to take for granted that all of our listeners share my or your perspectives on these issues. So to clear the air, may I ask you, from one intelligent, articulate person to another, what is a woman?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't seen many of these videos, so I went to go explore them because I was curious what I had been missing out on. I mean, it reminded me of my entry into gender studies and how exciting it was to think about the kind of function of language, the kind of ways we've crafted these ideas about what a woman is or what a man is, and also how those change dramatically over time and across cultures and communities. And so, you know, my sassy response, wishing I was there, is, well, what is a man? You're so invested in understanding yourself as a man and being tied to this notion of masculinity and in particular, like what it means to be a white man in America. What is it that makes you a man? Because it couldn't just be your genitalia, right? It's got to be something more than that. You wouldn't stop being a man if you didn't have your genitalia. So those are when I want to really get into the silliness of those conversations. But I think what's really going on there is it's pointing out the gender panic, right? It's saying that this is a gotcha of them having a gender panic, and that, like, in our society, right, we like to think that gender and sex are the same thing, and of course they are not. Yeah, I think it really goes back to the gender panic and our discussion of gender essentialism. But I think what's really important here is that I do think it is important for cisgender people to kind of consider the ways they perpetuate harm through the ways they do gender norms, the ideas they have around what girls can do and what boys can do, the ways they restrict rights and resources for trans people, and how these limiting understandings of gender also impact their own lives. There's been some great research about the impact of LGBTQ policies and GSAs in schools, and how having those in schools, at least in Canada, is beneficial to all students. So it doesn't just benefit gay and queer and trans students. It benefits the cisgender heterosexual students. And I think we often forget that, these ideas we have about gender and sex impact everyone.
Wow, I instantly have a hypothesis on why that would be. Do you? Do you know why?
Because we all want to explore and play with our gender and our sexuality, and we feel restricted and constrained. I mean, yeah.
I would have guessed that it's because gender policing would be the first line of bullying.
Yes.
And by eliminating that through having a visible presence of GSAs on campus or in schools, it prevents the beginning of bullying in general and therefore promotes a more harmonious school environment for all, even people who are not involved in those dynamics. That would be my, if I had to guess, that's what I would.
Yeah. It makes it a little less okay to use gay as a slur. It makes it a little less okay to use homophobia as a way to bully or discriminate. It like welcomes in the possibility that being queer and trans is cool and possible.
Nice. Yes. Okay, so let's talk about sports, trans people in sport, and specifically young trans people in sport. You spoke at the beginning of this conversation about the paternalism of liberal, centrist, and right-wing rhetoric, whereby adults know best, authorities know best, men know best. And you sketch in your chapter this shift in anti-trans and anti-queer rhetoric from a focus on sex education before the 2020s to a focus on trans girls in sport after the 2020s. But the common through line from the before to the after is this deficit model that you were speaking about earlier, this idea that adults have to intervene to protect vulnerable youth. But the lie of that argument is really revealed by comparing the gender panic around the need to protect young girls from trans women playing on their high school sports teams with the silence and obfuscation that we've seen around the Epstein revelations, for example, and the need to protect young girls from pedophile billionaires. You know, not so long ago, there were many cases of rape on American university campuses, which also puts paid to the lie of liberal, centrist, or right-wing concern about the need to protect young girls. So I suppose my question more broadly is, how do anti-trans and anti-queer radicals get away with posturing as if they are genuinely invested in protecting young women when they fail to do so in so many other cases, including, for example, with Epstein, the moment wealthy people are involved?
Yeah, I mean, it's going back to that protectionism piece, right? It's I will protect you. Those are the bad people. And you're right. There's so many inconsistencies. I think another way we're seeing this like attack on trans rights is through the attack from the right on reproductive rights for people. Those attacks on reproductive rights should be seen as like so similar, if not the same, as attacks on trans rights. I think the more we understand these attacks as being similar, the more we can create coalitions to push back against them. I don't know if I have a lot more to say on that, except that I really think that there's this idea that people in power will protect us, even though we again and again see that's not true.
Yeah. Sticking with the question of trans youth in sport and trans youth students in sport, we've been speaking a lot about gay-straight alliances in schools and their importance and impact. Has there been any sign of GSAs being involved on the question of trans students in sport?
Yeah, there has. The GSA network has made a clear stance that they believe trans youth, like all youth, deserve the right to compete, to win, to thrive, no matter the sport. And I think that's awesome. They're trying to gather stories around the joy that playing sport brings to LGBTQ people, and I think that's great, particularly trans youth in sports. And so that's awesome. I'm excited to see how that goes. And I guess the other piece I'll add around this, right, is that I think there are some schools trying to do something a bit different. So in Richmond, BC, just outside of Vancouver, there's a school that's pushing back against the idea that all of our competitive sports, especially in elementary, need to be gender segregated, and they're doing kind of gender neutral, non-competitive track meets and things like that to really encourage participation and to get away from this like separating girls and boys and leaving out trans people altogether. And so I think it's exciting how some schools are taking up this idea of inclusion and putting it into action, because I think so often it just stays in the realm of talk. So I'm excited to see how that moves and if it gains traction and happens at other schools.
Indeed. In your article, you mentioned quite quickly something that you mentioned also a little bit earlier in this conversation that we didn't get a chance to explore, which is how the broader trans movement has been informed by queers of color critique. And in your conclusion in the article, you draw into the frame a wider set of interests around intersectionality and queer and trans activists. It was so fleeting, I wanted to know more. Specifically, what is queers of color critique? How specifically has it informed broader queer and trans youth activism?
Yeah, I think a lot of like queer and trans BIPOC youth feel like they have to choose. They have to choose which group to be a part of, which identity should be seen first. And so a dilemma for many queer and trans BIPOC people is whether they hang out in straight spaces or white gay spaces. And that is such a bummer. But that is...
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, right? And so the critique kind of arises from that dilemma. So can we be seen as people who experience both racism and homophobia, and those experiences to be connected in a meaningful way? And I think queer of color critique really wants to think about that more. So whether you're talking about, Cindy Cruz or Ed Brockenborough or Lance McCready, those folks are really doing excellent work on that to, really talk to queer and trans BIPOC youth about those experiences, how they navigate it. Yeah.
Got it. As we move to wrap up, I didn't want to miss the chance to ask you about two broad limitations I noticed in your chapter. The first is that its title is about queer and trans youth activism, but most of the chapter focused on trans youth activism specifically. And second of all, the focus of the chapter seemed to be exclusively on developments in Canada and the United States. And I was wondering how much of these issues are being exported or developing in parallel in other geographies around the world, and how does queerness fit into all of it more generally?
Yeah, I mean, my focus on trans youth activism is like largely because most of my research is with trans youth. But I do think that the activism and experiences of trans youth are very much the same in some ways as the like work that queer youth are doing. And that the main kind of like discrimination and harassment that queer youth face is around their gender expression and about how they kind of do their gender in schools or in society. And so that same kind of thing, right, is happening for trans youth. And of course, trans youth also have a sexuality. And so the experiences are similar, but I think really focusing on the marginalized experiences of trans youth and their activism is important. So that's why the piece really took that focus. And then the other, your second question is like thinking about, how I've focused on Canada and the US, and that's partially due to those are the two countries I've lived in. But I think there are, in some ways, similar things going on in other countries and also different. So one of my research projects is talking to trans youth about how they choose a name. And so my research was conducted both in Australia and Ireland and Canada. And that work really looked at the stories that trans youth tell about how they chose a name. So I really like stories. I think narratives are a really important piece. And the context and the communities in which people are choosing names vary drastically across these three countries, but also there's similar kind of socio-political situations happening across these three countries. So I think, names are chosen within like language and class and race and so many other things that in some ways, yeah, they're happening in parallel, and in other ways they're not. Yeah.
Fantastic. You mentioned earlier the joy of trans people in sports. And you mentioned in the article, trans joy. What is trans joy?
Trans joy, I think, is trying to think about the joy that comes from being trans. And so it's thinking about like maybe the happy moments or the celebratory moments and kind of pushing back against narratives that transness is bad or that transness is hard, right? Because I think a lot of parents, when they first hear that their kid is trans, they're worried. They're scared. And maybe that comes out in rejection. But I think underlying it is a fear that they can't protect their kid from the hard things they might face if they're trans. So I think trans joy is like really centering the wonderful things about being trans. And I love that aspect of it. The worry I have around trans joy is that trans people might feel they need to perform that kind of happiness or joy in order to be seen as a good trans person. I'm using that in quotes again. And so I worry about that dynamic. And this isn't to say that that's always the way trans joy is used. I'm interested in thinking about the joy, right, that comes from choosing a name that really aligns with who you are. One of the things that kind of came up in the interviews with trans youth about how they chose their name was the euphoria, right, in contrast to dysphoria, but the gender euphoria that comes from having a loved one or a friend call you by your new name. It's just like such a special, wonderful feeling. And I think there's a way that fits into trans joy, right? I think there is joy in getting to choose a name that really reflects who you are.
Fantastic. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. It was really fun.
That was Dr. Julia Sinclair-Palm, and this has been another episode of Sustainability Matters. Don't forget, you can also participate in the podcast. Let us know what you think of Sustainability Matters. If you would like us to cover any particular topics in future episodes, or if you have thoughts on queer and trans rights that you would like us to explore, write to us and let us know. Our email is podcast@brill.com, and we would love to hear from you. If enough of you write to us about youth activism or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we do promise to explore it in another episode. For now, I will say thank you, as always, for being with us. I am your host, Ramsey Nasser. See you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.